This incident happened over 40 years ago. It has never been explained. Gary Mathias, Jack Hewitt, Jack Madruga, Theodore Weiher, and William Sterling, these men are known as the Yuba Five. This is their story. Let's start from the beginning. The five men, often referred to as the boys by their loved ones, were all very good friends. Gary Mathias was 25 and came from Olivehurst, California. Gary lived with his parents and worked for his grandfather's gardening business. He had served in the military but was discharged 5 years prior to his disappearance for psychiatric reasons. Gary had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was known to have had violent outbursts while in the army. Jack Hewitt was 24 years old and came from Marysville, California. Jack also lived with his parents and was diagnosed with mild learning disabilities. Jack Madruga was 30 years old and lived with his parents in Marysville, California. He had unfortunately been laid off from his job working as a busboy a few months prior and also had undiagnosed learning disabilities. Theodore Weiher was 32, also from Olivehurst, California, and was diagnosed with learning disabilities. And finally, William Sterling was 29 years old and from Yuba City itself. He was good friends with the rest of the group and was a deeply religious man. What happened to these five men was nothing short of disturbing. As mentioned, all five men were high-functioning and all attended vocational rehab. All five played basketball together in a Special Olympics team called the Gateway Gators, and by all accounts were very excited to be playing in a tournament that coming Saturday, the winner of which was set to win a week in LA with a trip to Disneyland. Before the tournament, the men had made plans for the Friday night before to attend a basketball game. So on February the 24th, 1978, they all got into Jack Madura's 1969 Mercury Montego and drove roughly 50 miles to watch the game. After the game had finished, they got back into the car at 10 PM to head home. During this drive, they stopped 3 blocks away from the game at Beers Market and bought some snacks. Afterwards, they left and drove south to head home. However, that would be the last time that any of them would be seen together and the last time that any decisions they made would make sense. Saturday morning arrived and the men were all reported as missing. All of the families said that this was completely out of character for them, as when they normally went out with one another, they would always come right back without issue. All concerned were now convinced that something terrible had happened, given that the men were excited to play in their basketball game, which they had now all missed. A 55-year-old man by the name of Joe Shones was driving on a mountain road near Rogers Cow Camp in the Plumas National Forest. He wanted to see if weather conditions were good enough to take his family for a weekend trip the following day. Unfortunately for Joe, as he continued onwards, snowdrift slowed him down to the point of stopping. He got out of the car in an attempt to push it to carry on, but this brought on searing chest pains. Joe was having a heart attack miles away from help. Obviously panicking, Joe got back into the car and began to think about what to do next. Suddenly, he noticed 2 sets of headlights, one of which he said belonged to a pickup truck. In the hopes that he could flag them down and get help, Joe exited his vehicle and screamed for help, but no one returned his desperate calls. Joe later said that on that mountain he saw a group of men, 1 woman and a baby. This group walked on, however, and ignored him. Hours later, still sat in the car, he saw what he described as flashlights, but when he once more went outside to retrieve help, no one responded to his calls. Realising that he may be running out of time, Joe decided that his only remaining option was to walk down the mountain road towards a lodge roughly 8 miles away. During this walk, he passed Jack's 1969 Mercury Montego. Nobody was inside, and Joe thought that it must have belonged to the group who had previously ignored him. Obviously, at the time, Joe was preoccupied with not dying, but authorities would come to the realization that on that dark, remote mountain road, Joe was the last person to see the Yuba Five alive. How did these men come to be on this inhospitable mountain more than 50 miles from their homes, you ask? Nobody knows. None of the boys knew this road and they had no business being there. Roughly 8 years prior, William had gone fishing with his father at a cabin not too far away, but he did not enjoy himself and stayed home the next time his father made the trip. Around 3 years ago, Theodore went on a deer hunting trip with his friends in the Feather River country, but it was much further to the west than the area that the car was found. None of the boys enjoyed the forest nor camping with the exception of Gary, who occasionally stayed out all night with his friends. It's important to note that each of these men led mostly stay-at-home lives and no one could figure out just who or what might have taken them up that remote, lonely road. The car had stopped at the snow line, and although the tyres had spun, the car was not stuck and 5 men could have easily pushed it free. The gas tank was still a quarter full, meaning that the men were not stranded. 4 maps were found in the glove compartment, including one of California. The keys were missing, but police managed to hotwire the car and found that it started immediately without a problem. The seats were littered with food wrappers that the group had bought earlier, and everything had been eaten except half a marathon bar. The next finding was somewhat strange. The police detailed that the underside of the car was undamaged. Bear in mind that the car was heavy, especially with 5 men inside. The stretch of road was very windy and bumpy, and somehow, in total darkness, the driver managed to navigate it perfectly. That was the conclusion the investigators came to, or in other words, whoever was driving must have known the road well enough to anticipate every rut. Given that Jack did not know the area, does this mean that someone else was driving the car? The families disputed that, stating that Jack was the only person to drive the car and he would not allow anyone else to drive. Investigators and searchers were hindered early on as a massive storm came in the day the car was found and over 9 inches of snow were dropped on that mountain. It was a perilous search and the SAR teams came close to losing members themselves just 2 days prior. Law enforcement was left baffled and the search turned up absolutely nothing. That is, until 4 months later. On the 4th of June 1978, a small group of motorcyclists wandered into a deserted Forest Service trailer camp and at the end of the road noticed that something was wrong. They described inhaling a rotten, nauseating smell. It was there they made the discovery. Theodore was found inside a 60-foot trailer frozen to death. He was stretched out on a bed with 8 sheets pulled over his body and tucked around his head. His shoes were missing and his nickel ring, gold necklace and his wallet were found untouched on a table. A gold Walton watch was also found and was missing its crystal, though the family said that this did not belong to any of them. Theodore was 5'11" and weighed 200 pounds at the time of his disappearance. When he was found, however, he had lost 100 pounds. His feet were badly frostbitten and beard growth showed that he had lived for between 8 and 13 weeks inside that trailer, starving. The trailer was located around 19.5 miles from the car and he was wearing his shirt and pants. Law enforcement had no idea how he managed to reach that trailer. Did he travel there on his own accord, and if so, how? Did he lose his shoes before or after reaching the trailer? They were never found. The trailer itself was locked and it's thought that Theodore had broken through a window to get in. He did not build a fire despite matches lying around. There were also paperback books and wooden furniture that could have been used. Over a dozen sea ration cans had been opened from an outside storage shed and one had been opened with an Army P38 can opener which only Jack Madruga and Gary knew how to use. Strangely, a locker in the same shed contained enough food to last a group of 5 all year. Another oddity was the fact that there was a propane tank in a different shed outside which no one had touched. Yuba County Lieutenant Lance Ayers was quoted as saying, "All they had to do was turn that gas on and they'd have had gas to the trailer and heat." Lance was left absolutely perplexed and his entire spring was consumed in the search for these men. Lance had actually gone to school with Theodore and his brothers, and despite not knowing them very well, there was something about this case that kept him awake at night. Phone calls were pouring in from all over the country. The men had reportedly been seen in Ontario, Tampa, Sacramento and others, but none of them were ever confirmed and were thought to be mistaken. Despite being a skeptical man, Lance, in his desperation, consulted psychics who were also of no help and gave inaccurate information, such as one stating that the boys had met their end in Oroville, in a 2-story red house with the number 4723 or 4753. Lance spent 2 days looking for this property, but it didn't exist. Lance spent many hours thinking about these men and knew their names along with many facts about them offhand. Theodore was a very friendly, beer-bellied man and would wave at strangers even if they didn't wave back. He got a good laugh from phoning William and reading silly segments from newspapers or funny names from the phone book. Jack Hewitt was Theodore's best friend. His head had a slight droop and was slow to respond. It's thought that Theodore really cared for Jack and looked after him in a protective sort of way. Jack Madruga graduated from high school and became an army veteran. William was best friends with Jack Madruga and would spend hours at the library. And Gary, who he also knew as being an army veteran. This case was driving Lance mad and he wanted nothing more than to find these lost men. He said that he would dream about them at night, and in one dream he got to embrace the 5 men. Then the next discovery was made. On the 5th, the day after finding Theodore's body in the trailer, both Jack Madruga and William's body were found 5 miles away from the trailer and 11.5 miles away from the car. Jack had been partially eaten by animals and dragged around 10 feet to a stream. He was face up and his right hand was curled around his watch. William, on the other hand, was in a wooded area scattered over 50 feet. There was nothing left of him but bones. Because of this, Lance tried to discourage the families from taking part in the search to avoid the distress of finding their loved ones in this state. 2 days later, off the same road but much closer to the trailer, Jack Hewitt's father found his son's backbone. Again, Lance did try to persuade him out of the search, fearing that this could happen, but Jack's father insisted that he had to continue with the search. He simply needed to find his son. His skull was found the following day, around 100 yards from the rest of the bones. The family's dentist identified the teeth as belonging to Jack. At this point, it's important to note that Jack Hewitt's remains were found northeast of the trailer, while William and Jack Madruga's were found northwest of the trailer, a quarter of a mile away. Searchers found 3 wool Forest Service blankets and a 2-cell flashlight by the side of the road. The flashlight was slightly rusted and had been turned off. No one could figure out how long it had been there. These findings also posed another frightening question. Why, between these 5 men, did they decide venturing out into the forest with nothing was a better option than turning the car around? And where exactly was Gary Mathias? Gary has never been found. His tennis shoes were inside the same trailer as Theodore, but that is all that has ever been found in relation to Gary. At this point in the search, it had been 4 months, which means there was very little chance of Gary being found alive given the weather he would have to have endured and the fact that he had been without his medication for too long. According to his local doctor, Gary was one of their major success stories in the way that he had been able to manage his mental health. The doctor said that Gary was very settled and enormously attached to his family and could not understand just what had happened to him on that mountain. During the search for Gary, his stepfather said that the entire time he was up there, he was looking for Gary's glasses because he didn't think a bear would eat those, but they were never found. He admitted that he became tired of the reporters asking questions and tired of not understanding what had happened. Gary's mother found it very difficult to accept that her son could not be found and regularly went back up onto that mountain to search, despite being told that there was no place left to look. The most common question posed to investigators was, why? Why did the men turn east onto the mountain in the first place? Why didn't they attempt to free the car instead of walking into the pitch black woods? Did they find the trailer by chance or were they led there? Why did they never attempt to start a fire? Did Gary try to seek help, and if so, why didn't his body or remains ever show up? Investigators later found that a snowcat vehicle had cut a path in the snow on February the 23rd leading to that trailer. So if the boys noticed this, it may have given them some hope that they were in an area where Forest Service employees might come back to. Another theory was that Gary may have convinced the group to head towards Forbstown, which is an area between Chico and the mountain road, so that he could visit a friend there, though that fails to explain all of the circumstances. Did Jack Madruga simply get lost while driving deeper into the darkness? Perhaps the men thought that the car was completely stuck and in a panic walked into the woods to find help, though saying that out loud it seems unlikely. The special agent from the California Department of Justice, John Thompson, was quoted as saying that this incident was bizarre as hell without a single explanation. Jack Madruga's mother said that she believes that there was some force that made them go up there. She continued, "They wouldn't have fled off into the woods like a bunch of quail. We know good and well that somebody made them do it. We can't visualize someone getting the upper hand on those 5 men, but we know it must have been." Theodore's sister speculated and said they must have seen something at that game, at that parking lot. They might have seen it and didn't even realise that they had seen it. Gary's stepfather added that he simply couldn't understand why Gary must have been as scared as he was. He continued, "They didn't even build a fire. They had all of those paper bags and didn't even build a lousy fire. I can't understand why they didn't do that unless they were afraid." The only problem was, no one knew what they were afraid of, including the investigators. There was no evidence to suggest foul play, and yet the whole incident felt unexplainable if there wasn't. There are plenty of things about this incident that simply do not make sense, especially where the actions of the boys are concerned. Firstly, and most obviously, why did they travel so far from their homes? They drove up a mountain to a very remote area. Secondly, they abandoned a perfectly working car and decided to walk off into the woods in the dead of night. It's also important to note that the men walked uphill and deeper into the mountains in 5 to 10 foot snowdrifts. Why in the world wouldn't they have walked back downhill if they thought that the car was stuck and wanted to find help? Travelling further into the unknown does not make sense. I can only imagine that the boys found that trailer as a result of the snowcat vehicle that essentially cleared a path to it. Did they all make it to the trailer? Given that 3 of the men were found in wooded areas off the road, perhaps they passed away before making it to the trailer. Theodore obviously made it to the trailer. Did Gary make it there also? As said, he was never found, but his shoes were found inside, indicating that he was probably there at some point. Theodore had managed to survive somewhere between 8 and 13 weeks before succumbing to the elements. Was he in that trailer the entire time? He never made a fire. Speaking of which, were they trying to hide from something? Perhaps they thought that creating a fire would lead whatever it was they were hiding from right to them. The men were considered to be high functioning in regards to their learning disabilities, but were all acknowledged as being able to function well. Given that they drove away from the direction of their homes and into the mountains makes me feel that these men were truly scared of something. Were they threatened or trying to flee from some sort of situation? Going back to Joe Shones, he was absolutely sure that he saw what he thought were 2 sets of headlights on that mountain. He said that one of them belonged to a truck. Could the people in that truck have been chasing the 5 men? Could that have been why the men drove into the mountains in an attempt to lose them? Though if this was the case, it means something must have taken place at the market they stopped for food, since they went there in the first place after the game. Joe also spoke of seeing a woman with a baby on that freezing mountain. Was he hallucinating? He also said that he thought he saw flashlights, but when trying to get help they turned off and he was ignored. This was also coupled with whistling sounds, but when he called for help, they stopped too. When Joe walked down the mountain to get help, he passed Madruga's car but didn't think much of it and didn't report it until he'd heard about the disappearances. After considering all of the facts of this case, I'm just left scratching my head. I can't come up with a simple explanation as to how these 5 young men, who despite their learning disabilities seem to function very well, managed to succumb the way they did. They abandoned their working vehicle in the middle of a blizzard and then wandered out aimlessly into the forest. Some, or all of the men found that trailer and then starved and froze to death for months despite having access to a fuel source and food. It seems to me that something highly unusual took place on that remote, lonely mountain road that night. I truly wonder if they saw something that absolutely terrified them to the point of no return. What exactly took place here, it's unlikely that we'll ever know. I want to end this by saying Gary was never found and there was no evidence of foul play. What do you make of this incident? Have I missed anything, or do you have an explanation that I haven't thought of? Let me know in the comments. I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of you that have subscribed to the channel, who share these videos, like them, and just generally show support. I appreciate it a lot and can't thank you enough. I'd also like to say thank you to my patrons for supporting me over at Patreon, so thank you very much for all of your support and generosity. Anyway, do let me know what you thought of this one, and you'll find all of the sources and links in the description below. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, it helps me a lot. I hope that you have a great day, or evening depending on where you are. Be safe guys, and I'll catch you soon. Peace.